Good morning, and thank you for joining this live BSI webinar on protecting workers and customers in the automotive sector. I am Francesca Bailey, and I'm here today to help facilitate the webinar. With me today are our guest speakers, Rob Brown and Kate Field. Rob is BSI's head of the global automotive sector. Recognized globally as an expert on automotive quality management systems and lean manufacturing, Rob has over 25 years of industry experience. Kate is BSI's global occupational health, safety and wellbeing expert, driving a global strategy agenda for creating a safer workplace. An ambassador for cultural change that puts wellbeing, PPE, equality and safety at the forefront, Kate inspires colleagues and stakeholders globally to make a difference. With over 18 years industry experience in occupational health and safety, Kate is recognized consultant, trainer and qualified lecturer. Prior to joining BSI, Kate was Head of Information and Intelligence at the Institute of Occupational Health, Safety and Health, leading on health and safety research strategy and technical content globally. Other experience includes regulatory inspector and policy and program lead for the HSE and health and safety expert at Augusta Westland, now Leonardo, Bureau Veritas and at EasyJet. So you're in safe hands with our experts today. Before Rob and Kate begin, I just want you to make aware that you have joined this webinar in a mute-only mode, so you cannot talk to each other or to us, as there are quite a few of you on the line today. However, please feel free to type your questions in the questions box in your webinar control panel, and we'll do our best to answer them in our Q&A section at the end of the presentation. We will also run polls during the course of the webinar to engage with you and gain your feedback. If for any reason you're unable to vote on any of our polls, please come out of the full screen viewing mode, and this should help resolve the issue. At the very end of the webinar, we will run a survey to ask you what you thought of the webinar today. I would also like to point out that we are running this webinar remotely from our homes. So although we hope this won't be the case, if there are any technical hitches, background disruption, please do accept our apologies and bear with us. Now, over to Kate, who will kick off this morning's webinar presentation.
Morning, everybody, and thank you, Fran. So it's lovely to see so many of you join us today. I'm just going to do, I think most of you are aware of BSI, British Standards Institution, and who we are, but we have some new clients with us today. So just a really quick reminder. A lot of you will kind of know us as the British Standards body, and we were the founding one of the founding organisations to develop the International Standards Organisation, and that's where our heritage lies in the development of standards. But from there, we've developed a much broader portfolio. Obviously, we continue to lead the world and support organisations in global trade through the development of standards. But we go much further than that, and we offer obviously assurance in terms of certifying organisations against those standards and supporting organisations through training and development on those standards, and a much wider range of services, and also, you know, very bespoke and customised offerings as well. And finally, we have a range of consultancy services, both in health and safety and also information security. And I think the other thing that's just worth mentioning is, you know, don't let the British fool you. We are a global international organisation operating in over 193 countries. So, you know, our reach is really phenomenal. And just in terms of kind of the subject today, looking at the pandemic risk, one of the things that we've done is taken our organisational resilience model, and this was something that we developed a few years ago, recognising that organisations are constantly facing, you know, challenges and opportunities as the world changes around them, and we updated kind of our approach and our format for presenting organisational resilience to match the COVID situation. So we had initially, when COVID first hit, kind of everybody went into a survive stage, which was kind of the period of complete uncertainty. What does it mean? What does it look like? And literally just trying to survive. Then as things started to settle down and we understood what it looked like, we moved into stabilize and started to look at actually what can we continue to, what can we deliver, what do we need to change. And about now, and again this does vary for different organizations, but a lot of organizations are now moving into the rebuild, whereas we still got uncertainty, we still don't know exactly what the future is going to look like, but we're kind of in a kind of a new normal phase, where we've got some consistency. We know that COVID's going to be around for a while, we're going to have to implement some controls, so how do we kind of manage that in that new normal? And then we've got the final phase that, again, some organisations are certainly at least thinking about, if not moving fully into it, which is the resilient, which is the future planning. What does the future hold? So it's just worth reflecting on that model and how we developed it. But to get everybody warmed up, before we get into the detail of the webinar, I'm going to hand back to Fran for our first poll.
Thank you, Kate. So poll number 1. To what extent has your organisation implemented COVID-19 protective measures? We have implemented a comprehensive range of protective measures, implemented some protective measures but could do more, implemented minimal protective measures, not implemented any protective measures, or I don't know. So I'll give you all a few minutes, a few seconds to answer that. And just a reminder again, you can ask any questions you want in the control panel, and we will answer as many as we can by the end, at the end of the webinar. And also a live recording will be available of this webinar after, in the days to come after the webinar. So I'll give you just a few more seconds for that. And the results are in. So we have 56% say implemented a comprehensive range of protective measures, 44% say implemented some protective measures but could do more, and there's 0% for the ones below. So over to you, Kate, for a comment on that.
Lovely. Thank you, Fran. Thank you for everyone for participating. Gives us a kind of a sense of where we are. And I think that will be reflective, thinking back to the organisational resilience model that I mentioned, that, most organisations are in the rebuild, which means that in order to operate, you've got those controls in place. So hopefully what we'll be able to do during today's webinar is really reassure you about those controls. And maybe for those of you who kind of in the some category, the 44% in the some category, maybe give you some hints and tips about other controls that you can consider. So in terms of today's webinar, I'm just going to touch very quickly on the general risks and controls in relation to COVID-19. It's important that we kind of keep that in mind, because it helps us understand what we then need to do in the workplace, which is then what I'll cover in more detail. And then I'm going to hand over to Rob, and he's going to talk through kind of, if you like, in a case study way, what that might mean in certain situations, in particular vehicle repair and vehicle showrooms, just to kind of give you some real live examples that might be relevant to your sector, but also will apply if you're working from manufacturing or whatever, some guidance. And then we'll have hopefully some time for Q&A at the end. Just a flag up, we've got quite a lot to cover in today's session, just managing that. So we're not going to have time to go into any detail, I'm afraid, about PPE or face masks and face coverings and how to look out for fakes. But what we've done is we've made our free guide on masks and face coverings available as a handout from this webinar. So if you look in your control panel for handout, you can find that document there, which will help answer some of the questions in relation to that subject. So in terms of just kind of recapping about COVID-19 and the risk that it poses and how it its transmission. I think, we hopefully all understand now that it's spread by the respiratory droplets, those that are emitted principally when we cough and sneeze, but also, when we're talking, or if we are doing exercise, or our heart rate's up and we're breathing more heavily. In general terms, those respiratory droplets are relatively large and heavy, so they don't travel very far and they fall to the ground or surfaces and clothing quite quickly. And that helps us understand why we have the distancing rule, because those respiratory droplets don't necessarily travel very far. And it's what seems like a lifetime ago, but it's actually only a few months ago when COVID first hit. The guidance was that those respiratory droplets don't linger in the air. Now, as we understand and more research is done on the virus, it seems now that there is evidence to suggest that the finer particles may linger in the air, which is obviously why we've kind of had the updated guidance about face coverings. So, this is one of the challenges that we have, is keeping up to date with the guidance and understanding of the virus. So, in the context of, we're still principally, they're large, heavy droplets that don't travel very far. But obviously, if people are close to other people when those droplets are expelled, then they have the ability to obviously breathe in or contaminate hands or face. And that's when the transmission can happen. And, again, we're still understanding the virus, but there is evidence that, the virus can remain alive on skin and surface for a few hours, or even some days on some surfaces. So, that's understanding the biology of the virus, and then that helps us understand kind of the key controls. So the personal hygiene, the washing of the hands, the covering our face and mouth when we cough and sneeze, they are the principal controls that we have to have in place. That's what's going to protect us the best. Then obviously the social distancing, so minimizing how close we are to people, because that minimizes the transmission through breathing in or contact with surfaces. Obviously, the fewer people that we are around, the less likely, again, we are to contract the virus. And really importantly, if we are symptomatic ourselves, or we know that we have been exposed to somebody who has the virus, then self-isolation. So it's just worth recapping on those basic principles, because, as I say, it does help us then understand what we're trying to achieve in the workplace, which is follow those key principles, but within the context of the workplace. So what are the steps that we need to take? Well, everybody on the call has already done some of this, so hopefully it just kind of gives you some reassurance. So you will have completed some form of risk assessment, identifying what are the key transmission and exposure points, how are you managing vulnerable persons, particularly in your workforce. The what or the who is essential to keep you operating, so what personnel, what operations and activities. The challenge of keeping up to with the guidance and understanding it, it seems to change almost daily, and it's quite confusing, and depending which country you're in, it's different. So if you've got sites that straddle different countries, and even if for our audience who are listening from the UK today, we've got different countries even within the United Kingdom, and they all have different rules. So trying to work out what it is you've got to do in each of those different situations is a real challenge. And then the kind of the last point, which is something that's is being sometimes overlooked, is making sure that we identify sort of either those safety critical operations or those safety critical functions or activities that keep people safe. So within factories or even offices, making sure that our Legionella checks are being done and are up to date, to make sure that we're keeping Legionella under control. So we've got to continue to manage all the things, health and safety risks that already exist, and then add on the COVID-19 safe controls as well. Um, and I think the other thing is, as you've gone through and done your risk assessment, and again, I'm sure most of you have kind of thought about this, is it's not just the kind of normal day-to-day activities that you need to think about, it's the non-routine. You know, what happens when the printer in the office breaks down? You know, how are you managing that? How are you managing the contractor who needs to come in and fix it? You know, have you thought about your emergencies, so fire evacuations, first aid treatment if you need it within your workplace, and how you're going to manage that in the context of the COVID-19 safe controls. So that's kind of your starting point in terms of mapping out your risk assessment. But then it's about looking at the principles to control the risk. And as I say, Rob's going to be looking at some examples and particularly looking at hygiene. So I thought I'd start looking at sort of social distancing. And again, you know, the less contact that we have with people, the better is the simple thing. But of course, that's not necessarily simple to do, and certainly not simple to manage and, you know, keep our jobs, keep our work going. So where possible, you know, the best advice is to keep people working at home where that is possible, for your own organisation, to keep it operating, and where that is the best thing for individuals. And I think we need to understand that actually for some individuals, for a variety of reasons, that, you know, working at home might not be conducive to their health and safety. You know, it might not be an environment that is safe. You know, they may be you know, sharing in a multiple occupancy household, which actually means it's very difficult to work effectively. You know, we've got to the point where there is a little bit more flexibility in terms of how we operate. So looking at that home working is something I think most organisations are doing. I think a lot of organisations recognise the benefits for a lot of people and for their business, and are looking to maintain that maybe for the longer term. But it is something that kind of needs to be borne in mind, and discussions with your workforce. So then thinking about who does need to come into the workplace, you know, what's the minimum number that's required in order to get on and do the job, and then the who and what else is essential. So, you know, what are the essential deliveries that you're going to need to make sure that you've got the equipment that you need to do the job. So it's thinking through that kind of what's essential to keep us operating. Then it's looking at what the work areas are, what the workstations are, and how and where is it possible to manage social distancing. So, you know, potentially in office environments, that's easier because you can maybe move desks apart, or you can have a rota so that, you know, people are operating on every other desk. But if you're working in a manufacturing or vehicle repair type environment, that becomes much harder because, you know, you're not necessarily able to social distance. You know, you might have fixed production lines, which means that you can't socially distance. So that's something to consider, and we'll look at some of the other examples. If you can't social distance, what other controls you can look at. One of the key things to think about with social distancing is kind of where the pinch points are, so where you're likely to get a lot of people at one time. And a really good example of that is obviously the entrance and exits to your buildings or your workplaces or your factories. So again, thinking about how you manage those, and again, I'll touch on that shortly. You know, toilets is another one. Again, sometimes it overlooks. It can be difficult to manage social distancing in toilets. So having other mechanisms in place to do that. You know, again, thinking about breaks and therefore break facilities, you know, your kitchen, your kettle. If everybody breaks at the same time and suddenly, you know, goes to the kitchen to get their cup of tea or a cup of coffee or whatever it happens to be, then actually that can be an issue. Just where people are moving around the workplace, so, you know, lifts, corridors, Things like smoking areas is another one that's often overlooked, and I've touched on fire evacuation, so thinking about your fire assembly points. A lot of organisations have done is increase the number of fire assembly points so that they can space people out. Obviously, during a fire evacuation, you can't socially distance, and that's one of the key things to communicate to your workforce, that, you know, if there's a need to evacuate the building in emergency, then it's get out, and social distancing doesn't apply. But once people are out, you can look and potentially examine how you can minimise the contact with the people who have been evacuated by creating additional assembly points. And then, you know, as I've mentioned, thinking about your delivery or dispatch points, and again, you know, delivery drivers coming in or contractors coming in or people leaving or customers coming in, and how you manage that. And in terms of thinking about managing social distancing, and again, thinking about, for instance, people coming into work, if you stagger shifts or stagger start times, that can be a really effective way of minimising the number of people kind of congregating in one place at one time. You might be able to reduce staffing or rotate staffing. So that's one of the things in BSI. We've just started to operate our offices, but we're operating a booking system for our offices, so that we always know that we won't have more than X many people in the office, because that's our capacity. So you have to book in advance. So there are a number of ways that you can manage that. A lot of organisations have created additional entrance and exit points to their workplaces, and again, that can be very effective. But of course, thinking about what the existing challenge risks or what new risks might be created, is obviously there then becomes potential increased security issues, because if you've got more entrance and exits, you've got the increased risk of people who aren't authorised to enter your workplace getting in. So, you know, it is really a complex thing to consider. Again, a very effective way of managing social distancing is creating one-way systems, and again, particularly thinking about the movement of people around a workplace or customers coming in. If you create one-way systems, then again, you're less likely to have those pinch points of people. I've mentioned contractors, and again, thinking about those who are sort of routine, who maybe you've got, or temporary workers or contractors who come in and help and support your organisation. But thinking about the non-routine, I've mentioned about Legionella. So, you know, if you might have contractors who come in and do your Legionella checks, have you thought about how you're going to manage the risks in terms of their safety and obviously the safety in the workplace when they come in? The same for things like fire alarm checks. Again, you know, they're sort of maybe non-routine that you haven't immediately thought about, and then suddenly you'll be thinking, oh, hang on, oh, it's the 6-month emergency lighting check. Oh, and there's a contractor at your door, and you haven't worked out how you're going to manage social distancing when they go around and do the checks. So it is important to consider those. Signage and marking is hugely important to keep people clear in terms of if it's a one-way system, to help them, remind them about the social distancing, you know, and again, depending where you are, and almost daily the government guidance changes in the UK, whether it's 2 meters, 1 meter, or somewhere in between. Different parts of the world have different guidance on that, but marking out at least the minimum distance does help reinforce keeping people apart. And the other thing that we've seen is a lot of organisations have used the outside, outdoors, to do things like inductions or meetings. But of course, and I'm looking out of my window here and I'm looking at the rain. That's not really practical as the bad weather comes in, and you know, and as we move into autumn and winter, that's only going to increase. So where you can't social distance, what are your alternatives? So screens and barriers are a good alternative. The challenge with those is that they become a surface that can then be contaminated by the virus. So where you do introduce screens and barriers, you need to then think about the cleaning of those screens and barriers, and to again minimise the transmission of the virus. So they are effective. but they are also then become a potential surface for transmission. I've talked about booking systems. That's really effective, where you can manage it for the workspaces that you have. You know, if you're customer or client facing, you know, I'm Rob. I'm still a little bit of Rob Sunder here. You know, you're doing a car sales room. You know, getting customers to book in is a good way of managing kind of the social distancing, making sure that you know, you haven't got too many people in the showroom. You can assign desks to individuals, so no hot desking at the moment. Again, assigning equipment to individuals where that's possible. So, you know, that can be from an office, you know, obviously a desk and a computer. But if we think about manufacturing, what's the equipment that you use within the manufacturing or vehicle repair, you know, right down to, you know, are people bringing their own spanners? I know that sounds really sort of simplistic, but actually you'll need to think about that. What is the equipment that is being used, and who's using it? And, you know, and if there are multiple users, how can you minimize the transmission if they're sharing that equipment? You can work back to back or side to side. So that's really practical guidance, particularly in things like vehicle repair or in sort of manufacturing sites where maybe social distancing or barriers isn't practical. Is, can you, you know, in the limited space you've got, you know, work back to back? That's the best out of those options, or at least side to side. And again, if you think about the biology of the virus, you know, when we cough or we sneeze and emit the respiratory droplets, they go forward and down. You know, they don't spread very much sideways, and they don't really spread behind us. So again, thinking about working back to back or side to side is a useful way of minimizing transmission. The other thing is thinking about fixed work bubbles. So that's fixed teams or partnering. So, you know, again, there are a number of activities which might need 2 people or multiple people in order to do the job effectively. Can you make that a fixed team? So it's only those 2 people that always partner, or 3 people or 4 people. And again, that minimizes the contact with people. And the other benefit that has is if one of those individuals does become ill, it's then much easier to isolate that group and understand who might be at risk than if people have been working with multiple people in quite an uncontrolled way. Think about, you know, no one deliveries and particularly personal deliveries to, again, more likely in office environments, but also, you know, factories and manufacturing environments. You know, what's not essential, and don't allow personal deliveries where you may have done before. And then where you do have, you know, delivery or collection points, can you develop them so they're no contact? So, you know, contactless payments, contactless paperwork, digital signatures, all of those sorts of things become really relevant within that context. So that's kind of gives you a guide, but some of the other things that you might want to consider is within the workplace, is, can you communicate in different ways? And again, thinking particularly things like vehicle repair or manufacturing where it's noisy, and you know, you want to have a conversation with somebody, you know, you'll normally might get a bit closer, and you might have to raise your voice. But again, if you raise your voice, then that actually potentially increases the respiratory droplets that are admitted, and they tend to travel a bit further as well. If you think about it, if you're projecting your voice more, they can travel further. So as silly as it sounds, you know, using your mobile phone and just phoning somebody within the workplace, or, you know, you might have radios, can be a really good way of managing that. Limiting time that people are together, so where people do need to come together, minimizing the time that they are, because again, you know, the longer people are together, that does heighten the potential transmission risk. You know, what can you do virtually? I think we're all becoming both experts and fatigued by the world of virtual meetings, virtual training, virtual inspections and audits. You know, they're working really well, and it's a really effective way of managing it. And I think, you know, again, a lot of organizations recognize the benefit of that, and you know, we've moved to you know, in many areas, virtual audits and virtual training, and the feedback has been fantastic. So you know, some of this stuff that we're learning now is going to stay with us because it works, but it also helps us manage the risk here and now. Communication, communication, communication. I'm going to come back to that. A lot of organisations are doing things like questionnaires and declarations and testing of their staff and their workforce, and all contractors coming onto site or visitors coming onto site, getting them to declare that they're symptom free. In the same way, a lot of organisations are also using sort of thermal screening, so temperature checks at entry points. I went shopping at the weekend for the first time out into the world for a little while, and one of the shops that I went to, they were doing temperature checks on customers as they came in, which I thought was really interesting. And again, you'll need to think about enhanced cleaning and maintenance of your air conditioning and ventilation systems. And you know, you can put in different filters that are more effective at managing and capturing the virus. You might want to increase the frequency of the filter changes. And the other thing to consider is making sure that the rate of air exchange is as high as it can be, and that's something to consider, particularly again in office environments, but also in a number of factory environments or manufacturing environments. Air conditioning systems are often based on kind of the number of people that are in the building, and as there are less people, the rate of air exchange has reduced for some of those systems. But actually what you want to do is set it so that it stays at a high rate even where there are less people. So I said I'd come back to communication. So I think this is a really key area, and it shouldn't be underestimated. You know, the more communication that you can give to your workforce, your customers, or anybody else coming into your premises, the better. And that communication needs to be in advance of attending the site. So you know, you might use online training or web pages for your customers. You know, what can they expect in terms of the customer experience. The shop I went to at the weekend had done that. You know, they explained how they were managing COVID and what you could expect when you got there, and that worked really well. You know, you might want to communicate by email. A lot of organisations, again, which is really important, are re-inducting staff to the workplace because so much changed, and you know, there might be one-way systems or specific rules that you've put in place in terms of start times. And I've talked about, you know, updating your emergency procedures. Staff workers need to understand what all of that is. So you know, it's not the same as it was before, so they need to be re-inducted. You'll need to provide regular updates, and particularly as the guidance changes. And again, that's a real challenge because it does seem to be changing so much at the moment. But you know, your workforce will be looking to you for an update and what that means for them. Same for customers, as I've mentioned, you know, what the customer experience is going to look like. And I've mentioned again, but it's worth reiterating, you know, the more signage, posters, markings, the reminders that you can have, the better. Now, I haven't got time to touch on it on this session, but you will get a copy of this presentation and the recording. So I've put this slide on here just to remind you to consider the psychological health of your workforce. You know, there are a number of, you know, really complex considerations in terms of the mental health implications, in particular for people while they're managing through COVID-19. So it is important to think about that. I'm sorry we haven't got time to go into it in more detail, but there's some guidance here. So On the left-hand side, you've got kind of what some of the risks that individuals are facing at the moment and might be having an impact on their psychological health. So things like isolation from working at home, or increased hours, or unpredictable hours. There'll be concern about job security. There'll be a number of things. So there's kind of an overview on the left-hand side, and then on the right-hand side, it's just some thoughts and guidance about what you can do in your organisation to help and support that. So as I say, it's just a holding slide to remind you, but hopefully it's something that you can revisit. So that brings us nicely to our second poll, and I'll hand back to Fran for that.
Thanks, Kate. Right, on to our poll number 2. To what extent do you feel your organisation's COVID-19 protective measures have reassured your customers? Our customers are very happy with our measures. Our customers are somewhat happy with our measures. Our customers are asking us to implement more measures, or I don't know. I'll give you a few seconds just to answer that now. And while you're doing that, just to remind you again, the handout that Kate mentioned, you can download from your control panel, and that will give you some really good insight on PPE and face masks. And additionally as well, any questions, then just pop those into those control panel and we will answer those at the end of the webinar. Right, we've got our answers up now. So 80% say our customers are very happy with our measures. 10% say our customers are somewhat happy with our measures. Nobody responded on our customers are asking us to implement more measures, and 10% say I don't know. So big 80% for our customers are very happy. I will now hand over to Rob. Rob, maybe you'd like to comment on that.
Yeah, Fran, thank you, and good morning everyone that's listening on to the webinar this morning. Yeah, I mean that's excellent, isn't it? I mean, you get 80% saying the customers are happy, so that's real sort of support for obviously all the level of activity that's been going on, so you can demonstrate your approach to managing COVID-19. So I think that's a measure in itself. If you're getting customer feedback, 80% of you saying the customers are happy, that's excellent news. So yeah, good, and thanks for taking the time to do the poll. Yeah, I mean, before I move on, just I think every time I listen to Kate and meet Kate, when I used to meet her in the office, but now talk to her remotely via Teams and everything else, you learn all the time. I think the key thing that Kate mentioned earlier about the nature of the virus and how it's transmitted and how we're changing all the time. Yeah, it's learning almost every hour of every day. So fascinating. And Kate, thanks so much for taking the time with the first session of the webinar. And I think really I'm sort of just going to take the examples and the advice and guidance provided by Kate in her first section of the webinar this morning, really in an approach where we try and show it in a real life scenario, I guess, around hygiene in a sort of vehicle repair and car sales example. So a lot of the information you're going to see Kate would have covered earlier, but maybe just look at it in terms of scenario setting. So if we can move on to the next slide. Yes, if we think about COVID, vehicle repair and car sales, obviously previously with downturns in the economy, aftermarket, automotive aftermarket and sales have been massively impacted previously. COVID, to a lot of extent will probably make this a longer process for them to recover. So there's significant number of challenges. If you think about vehicle repair, car sales, I mean, reduced customer demand. I mean, I thought it was quite interesting when Boris made his comment about, let's get everybody back to work, but please don't use public transport. So naturally, everyone's going to look to jump on a motorbike or jump in the car to get themselves to work. And all that lovely weather we had in the early months of COVID, when people weren't burning fossil fuels, disappeared and we started having rain. So maybe more cars and more traffic on the road went back to impacting the environment. Yeah, so obviously, drastic reduction in traffic on the roads. Obviously, MOTs were extended for 6 months. We had lots of interest and impact of obviously availability of spare parts, which is a big challenge. And then we look at the sort of rise in personal vehicles I just mentioned about the use of reduction in public transport, new car purchasing, likely to be reduced significantly. So you're going to see longer age, older cars on the road, increasing maintenance requirements, all those sort of knock-on effects in terms of new car and servicing. And then obviously a consolidation in the market may take place in terms of providers and supply chain manufacturers in terms of parts and particularly aftermarket parts. So let's move on to the next slide. Yeah, so if we think about initially the scenario and where we are in terms of challenges, obviously the big thing for the service centres and dealerships to manage is customers. How are we going to demonstrate, and how are we going to look at controlling the customer as they interface with the customer and they turn up into the dealerships and the service centres? So things people need to consider, I guess, in these scenarios are, well, people that drive by and think, oh, I've just seen that car. Let's go and find some more information. Let's just drop in and go and see how we're going to get it, rather than having it very well managed in terms of a booking policy, where you phone and make appointments, or you go online and make appointments to selected time periods, time slots during the day. So we need to consider things like that. Limiting number of people, as we talked about earlier this morning. Maybe we need to limit it ideally to only 2 people. Same family, same bubble. Approach in terms of the area. I mean, I don't know about anybody else. When I have my car serviced, previously I used to, get a lift to go back home and work. But now with Wi-Fi, you tend to sit in the reception area, read the magazines, or even spend 2 or 3 hours while your car's being serviced, particularly catching up and doing email. So all those things need to be considered. Obviously the drinks facilities, free tea, free coffee, free biscuits, all those sort of things will have to be and have already been removed. Kate talked very specifically this morning about, the issues about toilets and restrooms. Really significant controls needed in there, pin pads. And how do we consider, actually taking the car, if it's a service, taking the car, handing over the keys. Your keys then disappear for 3 or 4 hours, and so how many people are going to touch those? How's that going to be controlled internally? How are they going to be delivered back to you? So you can have your keys and think, well, okay, well, these keys in the last 2 or 3 hours have been well controlled, cleaned, sanitized, and those sort of approaches taken. I've just booked my car in for a service on the 2nd of September, interestingly, and the dealership I booked it into said, okay, yeah, Mr. Brown, that's a set 3-hour service that will be undertaken. However, we need to add an additional 30 minutes onto the service and 30 minutes after the service, because we need to do the pre-clean to protect our employees, and obviously the after clean to be able to protect you as the owner of the vehicle before we give it you back. So that 3-hour service now is automatically going to be a 4-hour activity. But I thought it was very interesting how they took the time to explain the reason for the pre 30 minutes and the after 30 minutes in terms of the cleaning and hygiene. So really good approach and an example of real life. So let's move on to the next slide. So we talked about customers. Now what about workers? And I guess we're probably quite a way down this sort of scenario now, where we're looking about how to reassure workers that it's safe to come back to work, in terms of how we're going to distance them. Obviously Kate touched on about use of desks, single use of desk, spacing desks out, maybe even removing desks out of showroom environments, and then obviously contamination of the vehicle. Do we allow them to get into the vehicle? How are you going to handle, okay, so somebody comes into the dealership and decides to sit in 3 or 4 different vehicles prior to the next people coming in. So how are you going to do that in terms of hygiene, cleaning, that sort of contamination area? So the handles of the doors, do we put things around the handles of the doors? Do we put covers around the gear sticks? Do we put covers around the steering wheel? Are there things that you can use in terms of covers around things that are there? So once the client has been in and sort of had a look around the car and tested a few things, you can take those off, remove, and throw them away. I know fairly recently, bizarrely, I went and had my hair cut for the first time for weeks. In fact, actually the first time in months. And obviously now there's, you have to wear a disposable gown and disposable mask. So those sort of things could be considered about ways of, reducing the impacts on the vehicle surfaces within the vehicle, and ensuring that customers, follow the rules. The dealership where my car's going into, they have effectively a security guard on the dealership, and unless everyone who's coming into the dealership has a mask on, you're not allowed into the dealership. Strangely, when I popped to the local shop yesterday, it's got a big sign saying masks are mandated in this shop. I walked in, I think it's quite a big shop, there's about 7 people in the shop. I was the only person in the store that had a face mask on, and that included the people behind the till. And I jokingly made a comment, and the lady behind the till said, "Well, we can't really enforce it, can we?" I said, "Well, I would tend to differ. My opinion would be different, to be quite honest. But yeah, so so whilst the guidance is there, it's about enforcement to a degree. And this particular dealership are very clear that unless you're going to have a face mask on, you're not going in, and that's as much to protect the workers within the dealership as it is us as individuals as well. So, yep, if we can move to the next slide, we're good. Yeah, so personal hygiene, Kate touched on a lot of this earlier in the earlier slides, and it's very, very important. Obviously, this is our responsibility as much as individuals about some issues about personal hygiene. So, temperature checks, workers and customers. Interesting to hear that Kate and her shopping experience at the weekend when she was temperature checked. So yeah, additional hand washing, hand sanitizer points, yeah, automatic not touch, and communication on when to use for workers and customers. I mean, I think everywhere you go now, outside the stores, there's hand sanitizers. You walk into Tesco's and other places like that, there's hand sanitizer there straight away. Talk about PPE, so PPE for workers, PPE for customers. What sort of risk assessment have we done internally within the organisation about how and when these should be used? Kate mentioned a lot this morning about screens, and I thought it was really interesting. And to be honest, I hadn't even contemplated the follow-up issue about obviously the screens are there, but obviously they're now creating more surface, potentially more surface contamination. So how often do they need to be cleaned or wiped down? Maybe between every time there's a customer comes in. What about work clothing? Yeah, so increased cleaning requirements, changing requirements, storage. The risk of the management of the PPE and the work clothing. Waste disposal. Kate touched on waste disposal this morning about secure waste disposal, single-use PPE, face coverings, no touch bins, all those sort of approaches that can be used. And I'm fascinated to go into my dealership on the 2nd of September, and I'll be assessing how well they've deployed the material we have in this webinar. So I'll make a mental note and write it up to see what they've done. Yeah, and I think slide 16 in the presentation Kate focused on was about, as she said, communication. So yeah, really, really important. Obviously, what we can do and what we do in terms of signage and implementation of distancing is great, but after a while, we could become quite accustomed to seeing the sign, or even not seeing the sign when the sign's there. So maybe we need to consider where the signs are located, moving the signs. Do we have to change the colour of the signs? Because obviously you don't want people just walking in getting so used to seeing the sign there they don't read it. So we need to consider how we might do that within the workplace. And obviously track and trace. I think most people now, whereas particularly when you go into restaurants or whatever, you have to record all your personal details before you can come in. So yeah, track and trace and how we're going to get on with the technology. So that's personal hygiene. We're going to move on now to talk to the next slide, which is premises. And as we talked about before, and I think the big issue, I think, around lifting in the UK and around the world is about, yeah, if you're outdoors, that obviously significantly lessens the impact. So is it possible? Are there things that can be done outside the workplace? If you think about the dealership, and the service centre, typically your car's valeted and cleaned before, isn't it? So, I mean, can that be done outside the sort of dealership, at the back before they bring it in? What about work areas, security? Yeah, we talked about protective screens. What about welfare facilities and all that sort of things around about toilets and restrooms, waiting areas, water fountains? I mean, all these sort of things now are disappearing from the working environment. Yeah, flow systems about how you use corridors, lift escalators, and that sort of thing. One-way systems in and out rather than passing each other in corridors. I thought Kate made a really interesting comment this morning about people bringing their own spanners to work. But when I was in manufacturing not so long ago, people had their own mics and verniers. It's personal equipment. So how on earth are we going to look to control the potential of people bringing their own pieces of kit to work? And obviously, if you think about rest time, kettles, what about milk? How are we going to do milk and keys? Really interesting areas. And then obviously you think about less visited areas within organisations, like the maintenance areas or storage areas, and how those things can be looked after. And then again, so if you're bringing your own equipment in, how's that going to be managed when you're off site? Where's it practical to do it? So some of the things to consider in terms of premises hygiene. So if we move on to the next slide, I note we've got about 10 minutes left of the webinar. Yeah, so I touched on this briefly about the example I've been given, really about the 30 minutes before and after the service. So yeah, regular cleaning, disinfectant of the vehicle, contact surfaces. What do we do in terms of disposable, sets of seat, steering wheel covers, gear lever, handbrake cover, all those sort of things. If we're going to use them, how can they be managed, and how often do they need to be disposed of, and how quickly and securely? Yeah, pens. I'm sat here holding a pen, doing this webinar. If I was typically in a work environment, I put it down, somebody walk past us after a pen, they may well pick it up. So we're going to do that. We talked about part exchange and car protocols, online sales and delivery, unaccompanied test drives. So if individuals are going to take cars out for test drive, clearly now you're not going to be sat next to them as an employee of the dealership, giving them the run through in terms of test drives. They'll be unaccompanied. We talked about forecourt vehicles. Are they locked? Are they not locked? Protocols introduced about how to view, how to clean in between, and how to move it forward after they've gone on. So the next slide. And again, yeah, all about cleaning. Yeah, what to clean, how often. So what some sort of if you're in the manufacturing environment, it's almost reintroducing your planned preventive maintenance activities. So what are we going to do in terms of regular activity, in terms of cleaning? The level of cleaning, the depth of the cleaning, what products we're going to use, how often do we have to do a really deep clean. The big thing that obviously Kate touched on this morning about the whole nature of this virus is that the aerosol and the way it's transmitted. So how are we going to do that? Use of hoovers, hoover in the car when you're valeting the car. Those sort of things need to be considered. And then cleaning stations to enable the workers to take the time to clean, and then location of all the information and equipment they need through the working hour. Does it need to be regularly filled up? What's the process of ensuring that the stuff's there, that the hand sanitizer's not run out, that face masks are there, gloves are there if necessary. All those sort of things need to be considered in terms of not just in the environment of a service centre or a dealership, but in general within the automotive and everyday life, to be there. So I think we're going to move to the next slide, and I'm going to hand back to Kate, and Kate's just going to cover this scenario about how do we look at the BSI workplace hygiene solution, and what work has Kate and the team been working on in terms of how we propose to support moving forward with that. So Kate, I'll hand back to you.
Lovely. Thank you, Rob. So I think one of the things that we've seen from our clients is, they have been asking us for help and support. Part of it is obviously these webinars to help give you guidance, or often just reassurance. And I think we can't underestimate that. But one of the things that we know from delivering actually our certification activities, but also the conversations with our clients, is that their workforce and also their customers are looking for that reassurance, that assurance that the organizations are taking the right steps to protect themselves, and particularly in terms of hygiene. And so to respond and to help with that, we had existing solutions, but we've kind of reconfigured and updated some of those to really meet the needs of organizations here and now. So we can kind of do to customize or bespoke audits. So, if you've an organization, you've developed your own protocols in terms of working safely, and you want third party or second party kind of assurance audits on those to make sure that they're working as you expect, then that's something that we can help and support with. We've developed a range of sort of micro training modules, kind of emphasizing the key bits aimed particularly at the workers about, again, personal hygiene and the steps that they need to take. We have a range of consultancy services. So one of the things that we've seen in terms of social distancing is the need to, maybe change the work setup, and which introduces potential changes or issues in terms of ergonomics. So we have expertise in that area. And then the last thing is, sort of reflecting that, both workers and, and potentially customers and clients want to see, visible demonstration of, organizations managing the risk in terms of COVID-19. And we've developed a kite mark service. Some of you, and I'm sure a lot of you, will be very familiar with our kite mark in terms of products. They're on the windows of a lot of our windscreens in our cars and those sorts of things. But actually we can offer it for services, and it's a higher level of assurance that actually the if you like, the mechanisms that you are having in place to protect your workers and your customers are being implemented in effectively, and you get to, where that is the case, get to display something visible within your workplace, the kite mark, to give that assurance. So, that's something that we've helped and responded with our clients, and something that we wanted to just make you aware of. So that gives us just enough time to consider any questions that have come in, Fran.
Thank you, Kate. So whilst we take a look at our questions, I just want to thank everybody for being on the webinar today. Let's see what we got. So first question, somebody says, with regards to the news today, they've seen that reports of levels of depression are increasing due to coronavirus. I think that's been sort of quite widely reported. What steps can our organisation take to help our people?
So that's a really great question, and I mentioned it within the presentation because it is a big issue and it's something we can't kind of cover in detail. But what might be a really good opportunity to make our audience aware of is the new draft guideline standard on managing psychological health in the workplace, ISO 45003. So it's part of the same suite as ISO 45001, which is the Occupational Health and Safety Management System. And what it is it provides additional and very descriptive, actually, information on how organisations can manage psychological risk. And within that context, obviously, one of the risks is, common mental health problems like depression and anxiety. So that guideline document is now available. I mentioned it's in draft, so it's something that you can review and you can comment on, and we'd really encourage you to do that, because these standards are written by industry experts and topic experts, health and safety experts like myself. But the more people that review those and comment, then the much better that standard is to meet your needs at the end of the day. So yes, if you go on to our website, and particularly our shop, you can have a look at the website. And if you go into our standards development webpage and search for ISO 45003, you can find the consultation page where you can comment.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Kate. We are getting one last poll set up, so as soon as that's ready, that will appear on the screen, but I'll keep running through the questions in the meantime. So how, got another one. How do we avoid complacency from our customers and workers in terms of avoiding COVID-19? So, sort of how can we make sure that those safe working practices are implemented? And actually, Kate, just before you answer that, I've noticed our poll has come up now. So this is our final poll that's more for information gathering, and if you want to sort of seek any further information. So whilst well, Kate's answering that question, if you'd like to fill that poll in, and then we can gather your details at the end. So over to you, Kate.
Lovely, thanks, Fran. So yeah, I think it's a real challenge actually. And Rob gave some brilliant examples actually. He said about his local shop, had a big sign saying, you're not allowed in without a mask, and then he walked into the shop and basically nobody else apart from him was wearing a mask. So I think one of the things that I've seen, and again Rob mentioned about his local showroom, and there's a security person on the door enforcing those rules, and that's the key thing. It is enforcement, it is reminders. If you are saying that you expect, for argument's sake, customers to wear masks, but you don't enforce that as they're coming in, then actually you're just going to be undermining all of the other controls. And also, your workforce will see that, you've said, for instance, that one of the ways you're going to protect them is to make sure customers wear masks. But if you're not enforcing that, then you're just reiterating to your workforce that actually these controls don't work. And then some other examples again that Rob gave. We're going to be very reliant on signage and reminders, but they become invisible to us very quickly. So moving them, changing the colouring, all of those great things that Rob said is a really good way of doing it. But it really is, that you need the enforcement, and you need the reminders, you need consistency, and that's going to be the best way of managing the complacency issue.
That's great. Thanks, Kate. So yes, I'd encourage people to fill out that poll that says, would you like us to contact you via an email or phone call about any of the following? We're now at 11 o'clock. So I'd like to thank Rob and Kate for a great presentation today. We're now sadly out of time, but if you do have any questions that haven't been answered, we can get back to you after the webinar. We hope you enjoyed the webinar, and please do leave your feedback in the survey, which we'll run at the end of the webinar. Thank you very much, everybody, and goodbye.